Sappho, woman poet, 2700 years ago. Sappho. So each chapter, and although each chapter, I'll show you the first chapter, for example. This is a chapter on Nightingale. One page, second page, 2.5. Not more than 3 pages. So what you get out of this book is this great, this enthusiasm about poetry. And this enthusiasm is very infectious. It infects the reader. And then you get this very diverse, wide knowledge also about this man having read so many different poets. This Farewell, chapter 130, look at the number of poets there. There is the famous Japanese haiku poet Basho. There is the Chinese poet Li Po, and the Chinese poet's poem on farewell. I would like to read that very short poem. It was Ezra Pound did the English translation, transcreation also a little bit. So, and that reminds me, Edward Hirsch very strongly supports attempts in translation. And he says, although people say that poetry is impossible to be translated, how else would we come to know about people like Basho, people like Li Po? And Li Po is 8th century Chinese poet, Li Po, whom again made famous by Ezra Pound in the 20th century. Li Po's short poem is Taking Leave of a Friend. That's the poem. Blue mountains to the north of the walls. Chinese wall, China wall. Blue mountains to the north of the walls. White river winding about them. Here we must make separation and go out through 1,000 miles of dead grass. Mind like a floating wide cloud. Sunset like the parting of old acquaintances who bow over their clasped hands at a distance. Look at the imagery. Two friends are parting. What is the equivalence? As if the earth and the sky, two friends in the horizon, now they have to part. They are joining hands. Sunset like the parting of old acquaintances who bow over their clasped hands at a distance. Our horses neigh to each other as we are departing. Even the horses communicate, feel the pain of parting. Our horses neigh to each other as we are departing. So this is, he says, the chapter, by the way, on farewell begins by Edward Hirsch's word. I would like to close with a special nod to the reader whom I think of as a friend. So the reader has stayed through 130 chapters. Reader has continued this exchange. So reader has become a friend. So I will take a special nod to him. There is mention of, as I said, these two poets. There is mention of Wallace Stevens. There is also mention of Walt Whitman, all talking about farewells in this. But next one, my personal favorite is chapter number 66. We have gathered here on reading, and chapter 66 is a chapter on reading, a poem about reading. And this is Wallace Stevens' poem, that Word document, if we can. Short poem by Wallace Stevens. I have put the whole poem so that you can also read and you can feel the poem working inside you. The house was quiet and the world was calm. The house was quiet and the world was calm. The reader became the book, and summer night was like the conscious being of the book. The house was quiet and the world was calm. The words were spoken as if there was no book, except that the reader leaned above the page, wanted to lean, wanted much most to be the scholar to whom his book is true, to whom the summer night is like a perfection of thought. The house was quiet because it had to be. The quiet was part of the meaning, part of the mind, the access of perfection to the page. And the world was calm. The truth in a calm world in which there is no other meaning itself is calm. Itself is summer and night. Itself is the reader leaning late and reading there. This is a poem about reading late into the night, where, look at the play of the word quiet and calm, being repeated. And so one almost feels like that there is so much ashanti in this world that even for a few moments, if you derive some peace and some solace, that one way you can do is to read good poems. That is one thing. Uh, this is something that, as a collective reading, I felt that, and as one who also teaches, I felt that every book must have a response in the mind of a reader as regards whether the reader has read anything similar or not. Does this book remind me of an already read book? This was my question. This was my thought. Uh, so it is books remembered through this book, and two books I have read that comes to me. One is by Harold Bloom, 2004, The Best Poems of the English Language. English language. All original English language poets, from Chaucer through Robert Frost. It's a huge book which has an introduction which is titled The Art of Reading Poetry. Once I shared this introduction with Professor Singh, and he liked it very much, that this is really a good piece to read. Introduction is titled The Art of Reading Poetry. And of course, this one is a very famous book by Terry Eagleton, How to Read a Poem, which when we were discussing once, Professor Singh and I, so Professor Singh says, oh, this critic has now turned into reading poetry. And then we opened the book and he says, the first chapter is actually on criticism. The function of criticism, this, that. Last chapter is how to read a poem. So it's a very misleading kind of a book that Terry Eagleton has, but it has become famous. However, so this is what it is. I have taken 38 minutes, and I think if you want to respond to it, I'll be very happy. Uh, I'll be very happy to take observations, and if you otherwise I have 10, minutes. Otherwise, at least I would like to read a little bit from Tagore. Otherwise, yeah, please.
First of all, thank you very much for this enlightening discourse and this initiative for reading books and
You are
deciding
part of
which.
it. Thank you very much. Yeah.
So that is one. Two questions. One is that what's the significance of this title of the column as well as poet's choice?
Choice.
If there was anything
Yeah.
he had in mind.
Hmm.
The other is that while reading this, as your presentation also seems to suggest, that this is one of those books where you have to actually rethink your strategies of reading a book, and it challenges us to actually rework your strategies,
Hmm.
and that it's a lot of work,
Hmm. Hmm.
discovering
Yeah. Yeah.
meaning and
Yeah.
things like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Okay. I'll take the second question first. Uh, I deliberately put the word discovering this reading strategy. No, once when you read about, and I did non-sequential reading. Some of the chapters I still haven't read. 130. Some of the chapters I still haven't read, but non-sequential. I have glanced through it. What is it about? But then it didn't hold interest to me. I went on because one thing that happens, for example, as I said, you discover that that diagram I thought is very good. That it is there is around the poem something. Then you stop and you keep pondering over it. Then there is something which digresses you. There is something which adds to it. And all three in totality then gives you about what is it about, probably. So you discover a strategy of reading. I am reminded of only how did I adopt this strategy. I am reminded of my classes when I was a student on post-structuralist reading. And there are some post-structuralist works of literature where page numbers don't matter. You read from any page to any page because each page seems to be independent, and yet somehow it is like the ghazal, that couplets seem to be independent by themselves, but yet the way they rhyme at the end, that seems to be, thumbs up, is like how it goes. That okay, they are all brought together in the ghazal. This is one thing. So yes, it was a joy to discover this strategy of reading. So that is as a reader, it gave me a lot of satisfaction, which I am sharing with you. Poet's choice, as he said, that after 2011 September 2001 September 9/11 2001, it was a lot of intellectual debate also that was going on about the place of America, about the insularity of America. And it is not that like today we have such a lot of criticism on the president of America by Americans themselves. There was also a lot of criticism of this American insularity, because of which they thought that the way they will work, everything will work in that way, and this has not happened. But uh, for example, there is a poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins, and suddenly Edward Hirsch says that God's grandeur by Gerard Manley Hopkins suddenly comes back in America, is being read, is being discussed, and people seem to derive some kind of a solace by remembering this poem once again. He explicitly doesn't mention anything about why poet's choice. He himself is a part poet. He is not a very famous, prolific poet, Edward Hirsch, but he's more of a scholar on poetry rather than a prolific poet. But he is a very well-read person in poetry. So one way we can say is that as a response to the reality, what happened there, and looking at that people are going back to poetry, he seems to have started this column where he takes up uh, one thread. He says that many of these poems are about suffering. As I said, Joseph Brodsky, suffering was exile. Many of these poems are about suffering, but the language, somehow the way the suffering is shared, you can feel the pain of the poet suffering, but the sharing, the language, the way the poem no longer remains very personal but becomes universal. Being very personal also becomes universal simultaneously, is how a bit of the suffering is transferred to the reader, but he says probably a bit of the understanding of suffering gets disseminated. So in a way, he says suffering becomes little lesser. So in that sense, it's a very subjective way of putting the poet's choice as a title. We all know perhaps that Rabindranath Tagore was hugely, even in a diversely creative, and we, some of us also know, and here Joydeep is also sitting here. Some of us also know that he has a bunch of poems called the last poems, translated into English. What is it? Shesher Kobita. Shesher Kobita. Shesh. Shesh is last. Is also a novel. Uh, there, Tagore seems to be working towards a situation. The poet who has written so many words, thousands and thousands of words, and so many different works, short stories, novels, songs, this and that. He moves towards minimalist writing, and he moves towards silence, the conveying of the limitation of language. After having used so much of language, he moves towards silence. So that was interesting. I mean, some of us know about it, but I thought I would like to share. We come to know about Tagore in this way. The last poems are not titled; they are numbered. So they are last poems number 10, last poem number 11, like that. A very short poem I would like to take. This is last poem number 13, which says, the first day's sun questioned the new appearance of being. Who are you? There was no answer. First stanza. Next stanza. Years went by. Day's last sun asked the last question from the shores of the west in the soundless evening. Who are you? There was no answer. That's it. That's the poem is about. Very cryptic, very enigmatic, but not at all wordy. That Tagore used to write so much. That is one I thought I would share. Being an Indian, we must come to know. Lastly, this poet has now been included in our syllabus, Aga Shahid Ali, and Amitabh Ghosh has written a wonderful essay after the death of Aga Shahid Ali. He is a Kashmiri Indian and he suffered brain tumor and died early. He is a poet who made ghazal writing in English very famous. I mean, he inspired American poets also, like Adrian Rich, to attempt writing ghazals in English. And this is his contribution, this Indian poet's contribution to world poetry, is to make the ghazal possible in English. Make the ghazal possible in English. And this is a long one, but I read 5 couplets from it. It's called Arabic. The only language of loss left in the world is Arabic. These words were said to me in a language not Arabic. Ancestors, you have left me a plot in the family graveyard. Why must I look in your eyes for prayers in Arabic? Majnoo, his clothes ripped, still weeps for Layla. Oh, this is the madness of the desert, his crazy Arabic. Who listens to Ishmael? Even now he cries out, Abraham, throw away your knives. Recite a psalm in Arabic. And he ends this by saying, they asked me to tell them what Shaheed means. Aga Shahid Ali. What does it mean? Listen, it means the beloved in Persian, witness in Arabic. The beloved in Persian, and witness in another. Thank you very much.